welcome everyone to another MassMEDIC virtual program. I'm Rachel Robinson, Vice President at MassMEDIC, and it's absolutely great to see all of you again. It's hard to believe that we are wrapping up another year of virtual programming. And honestly, we've saved some of the best for last. Not that I would ever say that to any of the other programs, but I'm really excited to have all of you here with us for what I know is going to be another wonderful session with Goodwin. So for those of you just joining us for the first time for this program, actually, this is the third session that Goodwin has been a wonderful partner on over the last year to put together with us. And this one on medical technology-enabled data platforms, I know is going to be just as fantastic as the first two we actually did on digital health. If you missed those programs, they are available at the MassMEDIC Vimeo page, and I will pop that information into the link in the chat. So I highly encourage you to check those programs out. They were really awesome. So before we get started, just a quick couple of housekeeping notes. Questions are highly encouraged. The Q&A option at the bottom of your screen is the best way to send those questions into our speakers. We do have a few different speakers today covering a couple different topics. So they will be checking those after their speaking portion is over, and where they can typing answers into the chat instead of answering live. So that way you guys will get the benefit as many answers as possible. Also, if there's a chance that your question doesn't get answered, we will be providing these to Goodwin afterwards so they can reach out to you to help you get those answers that you're looking for. So I think with that, it's time to get things kicked off. And I'm going to do that by welcoming Matt Wetzel and turning things over to him.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. Really appreciate it. And good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We're so excited to be here today. My name's Matt Wetzel. I'm a partner in Goodwin's healthcare regulatory team based in Washington, D.C. And joining me today are Kristin Havranek and Marty Gomez, my partners in the IP practice at Goodwin, and Steven Tjoe, who's a senior associate on our FDA team. And we're here to talk to you today about MedTech-Enabled Data platforms. Before we get going, though, we are a bunch of lawyers, so let's throw our legal disclaimer slide up here. We're just talking in general terms today and providing some information about changes in the medtech industry and a specific narrow band of companies within the industry. And if you're looking for any particular advice on an issue, please reach out to us separately. We're not providing any legal advice today, just doing an overview of some top legal issues. So before we keep going, I think what we need to do is kind of level set. What do we mean by medical technology-enabled data platforms? Well, what we're really talking about here is a shift in the medical technology industry's business model. So it's a movement from making specialized hardware that's focused on repairing or replacing or diagnosing, and moving towards an industry that sits atop a wealth of data. As technology advances and grows and changes with the incorporation of digital technology, artificial intelligence, sort of rapid technological advancements we talk a lot about in the medtech industry, these companies are no longer just making tangible hardware products. Rather, these companies now have a wealth of information based on patient experience, based on the data that's collected by the product, and based on provider input. And the result of this is some new legal issues in the area. And today we're going to talk about a couple of those. So first, we'll talk about IP issues, we'll talk about FDA issues, and then we'll end with a brief session on some of the compliance issues. Now, what are we talking about here? This is sort of a very simplified view, but as you can see in the top here, you have a traditional maker of a medical device, an implantable defibrillator, for example. As it used to work, the defibrillator would be implanted, would detect and correct an irregular heartbeat with an electric shock. The patient would be happy. Perhaps the product would be reprogrammed at a normal interval, and maybe a modicum of data might be collected from that device in more recent years. But as digital technology becomes more and more prevalent in the medtech industry, that defibrillator is going to start collecting data, perhaps via its own sensors. It could collect information on the frequency of shocks, the metrics on the heart health, and perhaps other metrics, coupled with data that's input, for example, into a mobile app by a patient that tracks real-time symptoms or real-time environmental inputs. That might also be coupled with inputs from the provider. And as a result, companies no longer just have a modicum of data about how the product works. Now they know how the product works in particular patients, how it varies based on different patient types, based on different patient environments, based on different symptoms that the patient experiences, et cetera. And that level of data is something that is now a valuable asset for the medical technology industry. I chose an example to start with here, in addition to the defibrillator, of a robotic insulin pump I read about recently that a blogger that I follow posted about, the medical futurist. If you don't follow the medical futurist, I suggest checking him out. But this is a product that's currently under development in animal studies in Italy. It's a robotic insulin pump that's implanted into the abdominal wall and surgically interfaced with the intestine, small intestine. A device delivers insulin through an insulin reservoir. And when that insulin reservoir is depleted, the patient is alerted via a mobile app and is able to swallow a magnetic capsule that refills that insulin. Why do I use this as an example? Well, I am a sucker for like all the advancements and technology in the medtech industry for starters, but I think it's a great example of how the advanced changes in the technology that we're seeing in our industry will result in more and more and more of this data. So for example, what if that implant can collect data on gut health? What if it can collect information on the contents of the bloodstream? What if it can collect information on intestinal health, et cetera? And so when it's connected with patient inputs and real-time information from the patient, from the provider, perhaps it's connected to the PCP's electronic health record system, there's really, sky's the limit as far as the opportunity for this particular product, whether it's for research, for drug development, for additional uses. As a product, but regardless, the real big story here that we're talking about today is the amount of data that's collected, aggregated, and that's usable by med tech companies. It's a shift in the industry, as mentioned. So in the interest of time, I'm going to turn it over here to my colleague, Kristin Havranek, to start us off with some of the top 5 IP issues that we might face as the industry grows and changes and evolves. And Kristen, if you just tell me when to switch the slides, I'm happy to do it.
Great, thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm Kristin Havranek. I'm a partner at Goodwin focusing on IP protection for emerging companies in the medtech space. I started my career in Boston after going to Penn for bioengineering. I worked for Genzyme for a bit and then moved to the West Coast and have been working with med tech companies as an engineer and then eventually as an attorney for 25 years now. I hate to say that, but it's true. Anyways, so my colleague and I, Marty Gomez, are going to take you through some IP issues facing med tech companies. So next slide. We're going to take you through some IP protection issues facing med tech companies that have software as their products or in their products and who use the data collected by devices in a variety of new ways. But just to frame the field a bit before getting into more IP issues, the categorization of your product into the buckets on this list actually might be really helpful in understanding how to think about and describe your software with the goal of IP protection. So just to take you through these buckets a bit, software as a medical device is the first bucket. This is software that provides information that's significant to making a healthcare decision and has a level of independence. So an example might be using a smartphone's microphone to detect interrupted breathing during sleep that then sounds a tone to rouse the sleeper. The software is a medical device. It requires no intervention by anybody else to actually wake that person up. That's the software as a medical device. Next, there's software in a medical device, which is software that's part of a medical product. An example might be software that drives or controls motors and pumping of medications in an infusion pump. The decision-making might be outside of the software and some independence of that decision is lacking. And the next 2 buckets are software as an accessory, such as basic encryption software or general purpose software, such as Microsoft Word or Excel, something like that. Most MedTech companies may use these second two or these third and fourth tools, but they are not likely being invented by the MedTech company. Thus, these software aspects are unlikely to maybe be the main subject of your invention disclosure. But for most MedTech companies, your products will fall probably in these top two buckets. It doesn't really matter which for IP protection purposes, but it is helpful to use this framework for how you describe your product in your invention description, focusing on the concepts of independence, significance, decision-making, and in particular, interaction with a physical device, if there is one. So now that you've sort of thought about how to describe your product, the next question is how to protect it from competitors who really want to copy it. Next slide, please. Patenting for med device companies traditionally is the gold standard, right? It's the most protective, it's also the most costly, but it's not the only automatic best option for med tech companies who have software-enabled protection devices that need that IP protection. Instead, we suggest that a diverse protection strategy instead should be considered. For example, because software is involved, trade secrets should be considered as well. When your product includes AI, machine learning, the design and learning mechanisms might be protected by trade secret. The key to trade secret is the secret part, of course. That means you need a robust and clear system for protecting that secret throughout your company. You might also use a non-compete or confidentiality agreement with employees as part of your trade secret strategy to ensure your trade secrets don't walk down the street to your competitors. Of course, patenting still remains relevant. The device itself, rather than the software or algorithms themselves, should be protected by patent. But you should also consider patenting the software hardware interactions, and the interplay with the medical device or the intervention. You can also consider using exclusive licensing to try to tie up the learning databases where AI or machine learning software is involved. Keep others from using these tools as a basis for their solution, trying to copy yours. Next slide. So assuming you're debating though between patent and trade secret, you'll want to consider the pros and cons of each and which will actually achieve your company goals. The main question therefore is, can the invention be reverse engineered? If it can, patent. If not, consider trade secret. In patent, you must reveal the secret sauce, right? So you have to provide a roadmap of how you solve the problem in front of you. This is fine when the device can be taken apart and the software is simple, knowing the goal in mind. But where this is not so simple and cannot be reverse engineered without significant time and expense, trade secret is preferred. And as previously noted, secrecy is key, and a robust program for protection is essential within your company. If you do end up thinking patenting is best, which is always easier to show investors as a source of value in your company, patenting software comes with unique challenges within US patent laws in particular. Next slide. Patent law, really kind of worldwide, but significantly in the US in recent years, requires that patents describe inventions in ways that are not too abstract. If you think about software, you don't have a physical device with technical features that are mechanical or physical in nature, and you can put in a figure and point to. So that's a latch, and that's 90-degree angle, and that's made of stainless steel, etc. So instead, you have to speak about software in terms of what it does. This is called functional language. You might say a software module that converts an analog sound wave signal from a heartbeat sensor to digital heartbeat data. That's all functional language. Ultimately, functional language is abstract. And the more broadly you describe something, the more abstract that description is. So as we try to speak more specifically about software and how it does what it does, we get closer and closer to the source code, right? But nobody wants a patent on source code, right? That's so narrow, it's pointless. So there's a tension between abstraction and breadth. Patentees will always seek to broadly cover their invention and describe their invention in that highest level functional way. But to be patentable under US law, you have to talk less abstractly and reveal more and more detail of your invention. So where to draw the line? Next slide, please. In traditional medical devices, you might think about describing it, the goal of the invention, and then describe in very good detail your own solution. For example, what are the technical features that are adapted or necessary to achieve the goal? There's the hinge, that's that geometry, that's that physical dimension, etc. You traditionally talk about alternatives to your solution, and in particular, you would have figures and describe these figures in great detail. In software, the analogy is that the high-level goal is the functional abstraction. You definitely want to talk about that. My software uses an implanted sugar sensor and delivers insulin to a patient from the implant when the sugar is high. The patent must also provide, however, the step-by-step pseudocode, at least, to achieve this goal. So instead of the figures that you normally have, what you will probably want to have are flowcharts and decision trees as your figures, and describe them in great detail. You'll also want to give your examples about your use and your design arounds, maybe alternative uses. This recommendation actually about talking about the high-level functional language as well as getting down at least into pseudocode, and it comes from looking at subject matter eligibility rulings by various courts in the Patent Appeal Board and the USPTO, who have looked at software in various areas and how they've dealt with functional language in software claiming. So now I'm going to toss it to my colleague, Marty, who's going to tell you a little bit more about this subject matter eligibility and some other things. Thanks.
Thanks, Kristen. So hi, everyone. As Kristen said, I'm Marty Gomez. Kristen and I lead Goodwin's patent prosecution group for medical device companies. Kristen focusing on the West Coast, and I'm here on the East Coast in Boston. If we can move to the next slide. Here we go. Okay. So, as Kristen was mentioning, for a long time, medical device companies have, they do a lot of patenting, but oftentimes it's been on sort of physical devices. We've been frankly spoiled in this industry for a long time. We've evaded the difficulties of the 101 analysis of whether or not what you're trying to patent is eligible for patent protection. These are battles that perhaps your colleagues in the pharmaceutical space, as well as sort of the pure software space, have been having for a long time. And now that these technologies are integrating with the mechanical devices of medical devices, it's here in the medical device industry as well. So just as a sort of a brief overview here, you really need to sort of keep this in mind when you're patenting medical device technology. There is a step, a ruling step that the Supreme Court has articulated for whether or not a invention is eligible for patent protection. And it's shown here on the right side of this slide, but the basic idea is, first, a court, or in this case, the patent office, will consider whether or not what you're trying to patent is directed to a statutory eligible category. And so those are processes, machines, manufacture, or composition of matter. All of those, pretty much anything you try to patent in the medical device space is going to fall into that. So then, we move into step 2 of this test that has been set out by the Supreme Court. They set it out in a case called Alice v. CLS Bank, which did not deal with medical technology. It was a pure software case. But it's still the analysis that we use when trying to patent software within medical devices. And the best way actually with a medical device, I mean, we could do sort of a full hour, there have been full books written on sort of this subject, but one of the best ways actually to ensure that a medical device patent claim doesn't get flagged as being an abstract idea and rejected is to tie it to a particular piece of hardware. So if you're willing to tie your patent claim to a particular device, In Matt's example earlier of the implanted, robotic insulin pump, if you're willing to put that pump into the claim itself, then you can also have software elements in that claim, and you're probably going to be able to get over an eligibility rejection on part 1 of this step 2A test. Because if you do that, the patent office is not going to consider your patent claim to be drawn to an abstract idea, and you'll be eligible for patenting. You still need to be trying to claim something that is new and non-obvious, but you're not going to get one of these 101 eligible subject matter rejections. Of course, you can't always do that, right? If you want to, if you're doing software as a medical device, right, as opposed to in a medical device, maybe the software is the product. You may not have a hardware component. So in that case, there are other prongs of this test that you may want to look to. So the first is part 2 of step A, prong 2 of step A. And that's, you can make arguments that what you're claiming is integrated into a practical application. And then you've also got step 2B, which is that what you are claiming is what the case law says substantially more. Now, all of these prongs are going to require sort of case-by-case analysis. I'll give one example here in the artificial intelligence realm. Oftentimes we find that you can satisfy one of those steps or the other. Frankly, they're a little hard to distinguish from each other, but you can satisfy one of those steps or the other if you have an artificial intelligence invention, if you can show that your AI performs significantly better than conventional AI techniques. And that may be with data, ROC curves, negative predictive value data. It depends on the technology, but suffice to say that if you can't tie your claim to a physical device, you're going to need to show something sort of improved with your technology. Okay, next slide. And then the other thing that I didn't mention at the top is that, Goodwin has a very robust AI and AI and machine learning practice. And so we help a lot of companies, including medical device companies that are trying to patent their AI inventions, sort of think through these issues. So, we didn't want this presentation to go by without sort of hitting a couple of the high points for AI inventions, which may be something that folks in the audience are looking at. So just a couple of high points. The first is, and maybe Matt will touch on this later, but you've got to make sure that, you have the permission to use the data that you're using. A lot of companies aren't used to, if you're just designing a device, you're not used to the fact that, if all of this data is actually going to be our, IP now, we need to make sure that we have permission to use that data. And a lot of times the consent forms in sort of traditional clinical studies are not sufficient to assign over rights for use in an AI model. So first of all, make sure that you've got a form in place or an agreement in place with everyone you're collecting data from, giving you rights to use that data. The next is, with AI inventions, oftentimes there's many other potential inventors than there might be just for a mechanical device that you're inventing. So, things to consider: individuals that select the data that's going to be acted on by the AI, individuals that review the results of the AI, individuals that select the algorithms that are used to train the AI model and that tune the modeling parameters, and then perhaps most obviously the individuals that actually write the source code that implement the AI. I put a little note here. We're not going to get into it today. There's a big topic in the field about whether or not the AI itself can actually be the inventor, sort of, robots taking over the world. I'll sort of, let you read about that on your own, but it's an interesting area that the law is figuring out right now. And then the very last point with AI is, many medical device companies are not used to using, software inventions. And one of the big things that is used in software is open source, freely available software. And in a lot of ways, open source software is a good thing, right? We don't want to reinvent the wheel every time we're doing, software development. However, you need to be really careful with the licenses under which you're taking that open source. And again, all of these topics could be full presentations, but as just a brief intro today, you really want to make sure that you're using open source software that is made available under what's called permissive licenses, licenses that allow you to use the software for free, but don't obligate you to make your own software publicly available, as opposed to copyleft licenses, which say, yes, you can use this software for free, but you then need to make all of your own software free as well. So those are the top 5 IP issues, and I'll hand it over to, I believe, Steve now to discuss FDA issues.
Great, thanks so much, Marty. And thank you, MassMEDIC, and also everyone for joining us today. Just a little background about me and my practice. I've been practicing at Goodwin for about 4 years now in Goodwin's FDA Life Sciences team, which is here in Washington, D.C. Our Life Sciences team has about 10 attorneys today that focus our practice on all matters related to FDA regulation of prescription drugs, biologics, and medical devices, and really more. But my particular practice is focused on medical devices, and in particular, digital health products and precision medicine. This stems from my experience at the FDA, where I was a regulatory counsel at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And I was there for about 4 years, where I advised on pre-market, post-market matters, as well as regulations, policy, and legislation related to devices. So I'm going to be discussing 5 FDA issues that are related to all digital health companies, or all medical device companies that are incorporating digital health technologies into their platform. While this certainly presents a number of exciting opportunities, including the creation of personalized medicine products, there are a wealth of FDA issues to consider at all phases of a product's life cycle. This includes from conception and development, and as we're going to discuss, even to the device's end of support or end of life. Again, it's too much to really cover in the short time we have together, but the 5 topics that I've selected, I think, are representative of the major issues that we continue to see today. And for all of these too, we expect to see developments really just right around the horizon. So next slide, please. Now, one opportunity that's presented as digital health technologies or other advanced technologies are utilized to accumulate massive amounts of real-world data, or that means data that relates to patient health status or to delivery of healthcare, is just this massive repository of real-world data. And the question really for FDA is, what can be done with this type of data? And more specifically, how can it be leveraged in informing regulatory decision-making? As those in the medtech industry know, and for sponsors of medical products, data from prospective randomized controlled trials has been for a very long time been considered to be the gold standard for demonstrating the safety and efficacy of a product that's regulated by the FDA. But FDA, and more specifically, FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health has recognized the potential value of real-world data. For example, recently, FDA made the case that real-world evidence, and that is evidence regarding the usage, potential benefits, or risks of a medical product that's derived from real-world evidence, can provide a broader and richer set of safety information to better inform its oversight of the total product life cycle, including pre-market submissions and post-market surveillance, by offering real-life clinical performance in a way that controlled clinical trials could not. However, there are certainly challenges with the use of real-world data. And the foremost challenge today for regulatory decision-making purposes is that FDA doesn't consider all data to be created equal, or that is, using regulatory jargon, FDA may not consider real-world data and its associated real-world evidence to constitute valid scientific evidence, depending on the characteristics of that data. And in 2017, FDA issued a final guidance document on this very topic. And while this is a discussion that continues to evolve and is ongoing, the guidance still reflects FDA's current thinking today. In short, the threshold for sufficient quality of data depends on what the regulatory use of evidence is going to be. So for example, real-world data that might be of high enough quality to be leveraged for post-market surveillance might not be enough to be used to support a pre-market clearance or approval decision. And FDA considers 2 factors in determining whether real-world data and its subsequent analysis are sufficient for regulatory purposes. The first of this is that FDA assesses the relevance of the data. And such assessment should determine whether the existing real-world source is adequate for evaluating the performance of a device and identifying its regulatory context. These factors include whether the real-world data contains sufficient detail to capture the use of the device, its exposures and outcomes of interest, and whether these data elements for analysis are capable of addressing that specific question at hand. Second, FDA considers whether the real-world data is reliable enough. And these factors include how the data were collected, and whether there's really good enough quality assurance measures to ensure that that data is of high quality and integrity. But where, importantly, where FDA finds this real world data and this real world evidence to be reliable and relevant, the benefits to the sponsors can be tremendous. Real world evidence has that potential to be leveraged to bring new products to market or to expand the indications of existing products. And it can be utilized to create post-market surveillance programs, which may be leveraged by FDA to lessen the levels of evidence that it expects during its pre-market review. And there's certainly real world examples of FDA having done this with current device clearances or approvals. But usually we see this in the context of FDA looking at data that's pulled from either registries or structured in a certain way, even if it's being used in the real world. Matt, could we go to the next slide, please? So the second issue that's becoming increasingly common as more and more of these devices are integrated into more and more digital technologies are integrated into devices is that they become connected, and cybersecurity becomes an issue. In recent years, cybersecurity has really become an area of increasing FDA scrutiny. And this has resulted in a number of safety communications, as well as inspectional findings, and also a number of firms have actually had to initiate recalls to correct their cybersecurity vulnerabilities. FDA considers failures to maintain cybersecurity to be significant in that it believes that these failures can result in compromised device functionality, the loss of data availability or integrity, or also exposure of other connected devices or networks to security threats, and that this could result in patient injury, illness, or even death. FDA expects device manufacturers to take a total product lifecycle approach to minimizing cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And it finds that this responsibility really begins as early as almost conception, really that design and development phase of the device. And during this phase, FDA expects manufacturers to develop robust cybersecurity controls to assure device cybersecurity and to maintain that device functionality. FDA also will assess these cybersecurity controls during its pre-market review of a medical device. But of course, even after FDA clearance or approval, the responsibility to maintain cybersecurity continues. FDA expects in the post-market setting that a cybersecurity risk management program is implemented. And that as part of this program, a manufacturer needs to assess the exploitability of cybersecurity vulnerabilities and assess the severity of patient harm if one of the cybersecurity vulnerabilities were to occur, and to determine if the risk to patient harm is controlled or uncontrolled. And this is a significant question because FDA finds that whether a particular risk is controlled or uncontrolled will help a manufacturer to determine whether a correction made to do that would be considered either a routine update or patch or a reportable correction to the FDA. And as we've seen a number of instances when reportable corrections have been reported to FDA, this has at times led to recalls to correct cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And last, I'll just quickly mention that it is also interesting that for medical device servicers, FDA has considered how manufacturers can utilize these servicers to help to ensure the cybersecurity of its devices. And it's at this time identified 4 priority areas to consider because they present unique challenges for cybersecurity. And these include privileged access, that is, what's the right level access to grant medical device servicers for their software. How these servicing entities can be leveraged to identify vulnerabilities and exploits. So in terms of communication of possible issues, what is expected between a manufacturer and a servicer with that respect. FDA has also identified deploying validated software patches as something that medical device servicers can help with. And there's a lot of discussion really about the extent to which medical device servicers can really tinker with the software without being considered to be a remanufacturer with regulatory responsibilities themselves. And last, as I mentioned before, FDA has really identified the end of life of a device to be a priority area because it could present challenges to the users of a particular medical device. So for example, while servicers may be able to continue to extend a legacy device beyond its anticipated support life, the servicing entities may not be able to control the cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So FDA has recommended that at least manufacturers make it clear to the end users when end-of-life support is and what that means in terms of cybersecurity responsibilities for that entity. Next slide, please. So the next topic I want to touch on is clinical decision support. As mass repositories of patient-specific or provider data is accumulated, another potential opportunity is to create these standalone software type products, and in particular, clinical decision software. So clinical decision software was defined by the FDA a number of years ago in a report as a tool that provides healthcare professionals and patients with knowledge and person-specific information, intelligently filtered or presented at appropriate times to enhance health and healthcare. Now, this is a discussion that's been ongoing for a number of years now. In 2016, as part of the 21st Century Cures Act, Congress actually acted and carved a number of these products outside FDA's purview. It actually carved it out with a definition of device completely. And on the left side of the slide, you'll see the definition of a clinical decision support software that's carved out of FDA's authority. But in short, it's a clinical decision software that's intended for the purposes of enabling a healthcare professional to independently review the basis for such recommendations that such software presents. So that's not the intent of a healthcare professional to rely primarily on those recommendations. Now, over the years after the implementation of this act, FDA has issued a couple of guidances, which are still draft actually, to interpret what FDA thinks would be excluded because it is clinical decision support software. And interestingly, FDA has actually expanded on Congress's approach. So FDA has found that even if an independent a healthcare provider could not independently review the basis of a clinical decision support software's recommendation, that could still be under enforcement discretion, so long as it's only intended to inform decisions regarding non-serious conditions. And similarly, FDA has also expanded it so that it doesn't have to be intended just for a healthcare professional. These types of softwares can be intended for the patients or the caregivers, and FDA would exercise enforcement discretion, meaning that FDA wouldn't enforce its regulatory requirements for these types of products if that type of product is intended to inform management recommendations for non-serious conditions, but also that patient and caregiver can independently review the basis for the recommendation. This slide's really illustrative of a larger point though. FDA, particularly in the standalone software space, has really worked for years to find efficiencies and priorities for its pre-market review. So anytime a standalone software is being developed, should be a priority to conduct an assessment of the regulatory requirements that apply to that software because there are so many type of functionalities that FDA would not actively regulate as a medical device. We'll move on to the next slide, Matt. So I wanted to touch very quickly too on the topic of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So this is at the other end of the spectrum. Software that has artificial intelligence and machine learning capabilities are likely to be the focus of FDA's enforcement priorities, meaning that these are the types of products that FDA would most likely be interested in reviewing through FDA's pre-market review mechanisms. And that's not to say that the FDA isn't exploring flexibilities for its regulatory framework for the regulation of these devices. It's just that pre-market review is more likely to be required. And on this slide, I highlight two ongoing areas of discussion for AI and ML devices. One is the transparency of these devices. So recently, FDA had hosted a workshop. It was just October 14th, actually, a couple of weeks ago, on the transparency of these AI ML devices. And really the takeaways here were that patients, providers are looking for device labeling or other type of correspondence that really educate them about the device's limitations, about how to take the recommendations from these algorithms and understand how to make informed decisions based on those recommendations. And there was a number of ways that they recommended that this can be done, including having intuitive user interfaces, having ways to communicate to the manufacturer if they are receiving unexpected results and the like. A second area that's been under discussion is this good machine learning practice guideline. This was actually just issued. It was issued on October 27th, and it was issued pursuant to FDA's AI/ML-based software as the Medical Device Action Plan, which was issued earlier this year. This was a guideline essentially that was developed by the FDA in conjunction with Health Canada and also the MHRA, the regulatory authority in the UK. But essentially, FDA and these other regulatory authorities have set out 10 guiding principles that are not formal and not binding, but may provide developers and identify areas where these standards organizations could take these guiding principles and make them into something more concrete in terms of policy. I'll highlight just one of these, but there were 10 guiding principles. The very first guiding principle is that multidisciplinary expertise is leveraged throughout the total product lifecycle. This is interesting because FDA here is really suggesting that the traditional development process be rethought when machine learning is involved. And it should include inputs from other internal stakeholders at a company. This could include the Chief Information Security Officer, privacy and data strategy personnel, as well as the medical personnel. And also, FDA is recommending early input from all stakeholders for this purpose. Now we can move on to the last slide. So I mentioned at the outset of this presentation that all the topics that we're discussing today are rapidly evolving, and changes really are anticipated really right around the horizon. This is really true for all FDA frameworks that really are relevant to the regulation of software as a medical device or standalone software. So, with respect to AI and ML in particular, you'll see on the left side of the screen FDA's vision or working model for how these products could be regulated. As you'll see, it's very different from how traditional medical devices are currently regulated. It includes this concept of pre-certification, or this organizational level of review that could be used to somehow streamline pre-market review later on for modifications of devices to streamline the requirements for that. Now, this is currently just a pilot at the FDA. There's a lot of discussion that still needs to happen, but we should be expecting an update for that soon. FDA has also published their expected guidance documents for the next year for fiscal year 2022. And you'll see that almost every topic that we discussed today is anticipated to have a guidance update. So you'll see that there's going to be guidance updates on clinical decision support, on cybersecurity, on marketing submission recommendations, and change control plans for AI/ML software. And of course, there's a long-awaited guidance document regarding the content on pre-market submissions for both software as a medical device and software in medical devices. Okay, so those are the top 5 issues for medical devices. I'll pass things on to my colleague, Matt.
Thanks so much, Steve, and thanks, Kristen and Marty. Really appreciate the insight into those issues. And you might have noticed as we have been moving through the slides that we've referred to these companies as medical technology-enabled data platforms, and we've tried to start the moniker MTED to kind of define that group of companies. So if you see that throughout here, that's what we're referring to. And if you like that, we do encourage you to use it. We think it's a good moniker. We want to pick up on that. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the top 5 compliance issues that MedTech-enabled data platform companies might face. And I've got a hard stop at 2. I know many of you do as well. So I'm going to do a lightning round here. But first, the sort of top of mind issue here from my perspective is the lack of advanced industry standards. For those of you who do know me, I spent time at AdvaMed as the Deputy General Counsel. I worked with AdvaMed to refine and revise its industry codes, both here and in the US and in China as well. And we know that the current industry codes for the medical device industry, whether that's AdvaMed or MDMA, are really focused on sort of traditional sales and marketing issues, which is great. That's the guidance that companies need. They still need it. It's absolutely required. It's good guidance. But you can see on the left here some of the topics that are covered: consulting arrangements, business courtesies, training and education. But what's missing for the MTED companies? These are companies that now have this wealth of data that's collected from the advanced technologies that's incorporated into a medical device. But not all of their issues are there. And we do know that companies like to travel in a herd, so to speak, and to comply with the industry standards and best practices. But there's some gaps here. For example, the ethics of data sharing, as we talked about, interactions with third-party app developers as they start to take a more prevalent role in the development of medical technology and medical devices. Value-based arrangements, we'll talk about that in a minute, and how these companies can really engage with other stakeholders to deliver value-based care or care coordination. Information blocking, interoperability, all these concepts that others in the digital health space have grappled with for a while. And now medical technology companies, more traditional medical device companies, I should say, are starting to deal more and more with these issues. So you can see what some of those concerns might be there on the right. Number 4, new regulatory regime. Well, part of the promise of MedTech-Enabled Data platforms is the opportunity to take this wealth of knowledge, this wealth of data, and streamline care, help coordinate care, to understand more specifically which patient is going to react better under which circumstances to which piece of technology, the opportunity to monitor and to track real-time quality outcomes, physician input, patient input, the opportunity for more patient-centric solutions. And then, of course, we've been talking about AI and machine learning as we incorporate those technological advancements into this significant pool of data. That enhanced data view just really empowers greater care, more nearly tailored care. And then, of course, cost savings. There's less trial and error and more accuracy based on the data that we have. Well, as you all know, last year, in fact, exactly a year ago, November 2020, OIG released several new safe harbors to the Anti-Kickback statute. The idea was that the government wanted to encourage more value-based arrangements or more care coordination arrangements. And the current version of the kickback statute is based on a fee-for-service model. In other words, the kickback statute is designed to address behavior whereby you have a service and a payment, a service and a payment. But the move is to value-based care, whereby groups of organizations are working to provide care to the same patient, and they might receive one payment based on good quality outcomes or based on cost savings that are achieved, based on the value that's delivered to that target patient population. As many of you know, if you've dug into the final rule from OIG last year, the same way that I have, you know that OIG has a very skeptical view of the industry. They're skeptical of the drug industry, the medical technology industry, laboratories, durable medical equipment, and pharmacies. They, in fact, were very clear that those entities cannot participate in the protections of the safe harbor for things like delivering value-based care, care coordination arrangements, et cetera, pointing to those industries' previous issues with fraud and fraud enforcement. Now, notably, there was certainly some headlines from the industry that, quote, limited technology participants could be protected by the value-based safe harbors, but OIG there kept that as a very narrow sliver of companies. So a limited technology participant is essentially a company that delivers some sort of digital technology solution, but that does not register itself as a physician-owned distributor under the Sunshine Act. It's a very narrow definition. One point that many folks have missed is that CMS actually indicated earlier this year a proposal that any privately held medical technology company that has any amount of physician ownership would have to register itself as a physician-owned distributor. So that window of a limited technology participant has gotten even more narrow over time. What does this mean? Why is this an issue for MTED companies? Well, MTED companies, as mentioned, have the opportunity to streamline care, coordinate care, create better outcomes. And without the safe harbor protections, companies need to be very cognizant about how they structure those relationships, those value-based arrangements they might want to enter into with a health system or a payer or a practice group, physician practice group, et cetera. So just one of the new regulatory regime issues that companies might face. Similarly, also in the same release in November of last year, OIG took the opportunity to evolve its electronic health record safe harbor and to create a new safe harbor for cybersecurity. What does that mean? That means that companies can now donate electronic health records technology or donate cybersecurity technology to the extent that it's necessary to protect the exchange of information between the various parties. Why is this important today? Well, a couple of reasons. So first, as companies develop greater data platforms, there might be more of a need for them to provide EHR technology to their customers or cybersecurity technology to their customers. And so therefore, these are items of value. They might potentially need to be tracked under the Sunshine Act. How do you track those? How do you assign a value to those? How do you assess whether there's a legitimate need to actually undertake the donation? So just some of the compliance issues that chief compliance officers and lawyers and med tech companies that are developing an extensive data platform need to be contemplating. Similarly, on the information blocking side, new concepts that digital health and digital technology companies have been dealing with for a little bit of time, a little bit longer than the traditional medical device industry. But the idea that any sort of technology that's exchanged between the parties can't have any sort of information blocking. It must be usable with other EHR and cybersecurity systems. And these new rules and regulations certainly are quite complicated. And again, require a watchful eye from compliance at the med tech companies, at these MTED companies, I should say, as they continue to advance in this area. Thinking about the role of the compliance officer at traditional medical technology companies and evolving data platform companies, well, typically the real risk area has been around interactions with providers, with the customers, those entities that can write an order. And in fact, that's what OIG cites to as part of the reason for its concern with expanding its value-based regs, is the fact that these companies, our companies, I should say, are really dependent upon a physician order. And therefore that relationship with the physician can become an issue. Well, we're moving from a treatment and provider-centric model to a preventative and patient-centric model. So companies are going to be more focused on interactions with patients. We know, just as in the drug industry alone, interactions with patient groups creates a lot of issues from a healthcare fraud and beneficiary inducement standpoint. And just given this expansion of companies' capabilities, the data platform capabilities, and the expansion into more preventative patient-centric work, we can expect to see some greater concerns there, greater interactions with patients, training specific for patients on how to use the technology. We talk a lot about sampling in the medical technology industry. How do you provide a sample when you're working with a data platform? And then, of course, perhaps a decreased emphasis on the provider serving as a learned intermediary between the company and the patient. So those are all just sort of changing concepts that need to be taken into account as companies advance and as they gain access to more data. On the flip side, HCP relationships are changing. There's now a greater emphasis on the role of technology, engineers, PhDs, app developers into the development of the product, and maybe a little bit less emphasis on a physician providing input into that product. So what's the right balance there? What's the right way to structure those relationships? And then, of course, we talked previously about the promise and the opportunity of these companies and the opportunity for that data to be leveraged for research on new drugs, on new devices, new apps, new opportunities for HCPs. And so what are the joint marketing relationships supposed to look like as companies grow beyond just the traditional medical device technology? And then finally, as you can imagine, the top issue that's really going to face companies from a compliance perspective is ethical values around data collection, use, and sharing. So of course, we've got the legal mandates on the privacy side, and there's certain requirements there that are, of course, difficult to meet and complicated. GDPR, HIPAA, Virginia's new privacy law, California's law, et cetera. But perhaps even a little bit deeper than that are these ethical values. Now you have patient-sensitive information that's grown. A number companies are hungry for this information that perhaps maybe they haven't collected previously, and it's also a new potential revenue stream for companies as well. So keeping a watchful eye as the compliance officer at one of these companies on the values and principles that form the foundation of corporate culture is really critical. And while it's not entirely different than those cultural values that we might see today, there is a greater emphasis on patient interactions, making sure that the vulnerable information and the vulnerable patient is protected. So just a couple of the key issues from a compliance perspective. We do have a couple of minutes left for Q&A, and Kristen, Marty, Steve, I haven't been monitoring the Q&A in here, but do we have some questions to answer?
I think we've been handling them as they've been coming in, Matt. So I think we're, unless anybody wants to type something in, I think all the questions have been answered at this point.
Okay, yeah, you guys are awesome. I think you covered pretty much everything. I've been keeping an eye on the chat as well. We will keep the line open for another 2 minutes. I know there's probably a hard stop for everyone. I did just put the link to the Vimeo for our MassMEDIC channel in the chat option. If you just go into that link and type digital health, you can find the other 2 programs that we did with Goodwin in the last 6 months, covering similar topics. But guys, this was an incredible webinar. Thank you both all so much for doing this and for putting together that incredible amount of information. We will absolutely be sharing the video with everyone afterwards. But thank you, Kristen, Steven, Marty, and Matt. That was fantastic.
Well, thanks so much. And please, anybody, if you have questions, reach out to us. Our emails are in this presentation, and Rachel and the MassMEDIC team have our contact information. We know this has been a lot, kind of an omnibus presentation here, but just wanted to give you a flavor for, sort of the breadth of issues that the medical technology industry is facing as the business model evolves.
Thank you so much. And everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. But thank you guys again. This is wonderful. And I hope to see you guys soon.
All.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.